Hi, I'm Jonas Dupuis. Welcome to another episode of the Bonsai Wire podcast. Today, I will be speaking with co-host Michael Hagedorn about his recent book, Bonsai Heresy. Hello, Michael.
Hello. Hi. Great to be here.
Are you ready to talk about bonsai today?
I am. Bonsai today. I love it. Maybe even a bit of bonsai tonight.
And that will be a little bit of foreshadowing for some later topics.
Right.
What I was hoping
this is a double header.
Exactly.
We're interviewing Jonas tomorrow morning. I am interviewing Jonas tomorrow morning about his book, The Little Book of Bonsai. So stay tuned.
The Little Book of Bonsai Heresy. We'll have it all figured out at some point. And so what I wanted to start with is talk about some of the topics that come up in your book, as I was lucky enough to read some early drafts of the book and was delighted to see how much improvement it continued to go through by the time it finally came out. It is just a spectacular read and highly recommended for people at pretty much every stage of their bonsai journey. And the questions that came up while I was going through it, a lot of them are just personal questions that I have that you might be able to help with. Others are ideas that really struck me as I was going through it again recently.
Yeah, sounds great.
I wanted to start by asking, could you tell me about how time-tested anecdotal evidence informs our bonsai practice?
Okay. Yeah, sure. It took a long time for me to realize that was actually going on, but the anecdotal evidence is actually the tradition of bonsai. And science is the thing that came much later to support or in some cases to deny what was going on within the tradition. So with anecdote, it's a trial and error kind of exercise, and this is a process that is familiar to any sort of non-scientific adventure that involves things in the real world. With bonsai tradition, a great example is black pine decandling. This was sort of not a mistake, but rather sort of a caterpillar accident that happened many years ago, and it turned into something that became a deeply embedded part of bonsai tradition. And Jonas played a really huge role in sleuthing out the timing of that, because myself and others in the bonsai community thought that black pine decandling was more recent than what we actually discovered. And you, Jonas, you had a book that had Sachi Suzuki, writing about his discovery of this, and it was back in the 30s, right? It was like,
yeah, I think it was 37, 38, something like that.
Yeah. Which was decades before I had ever heard that this was created. So there were a lot of discoveries in writing this book, but that's an example of sort of the anecdotal nature. So this ended up being something that Suzuki was, and this is not my teacher. This is Sachi Suzuki, not Shinji Suzuki. So this is different generation, 2 generations before. He observed a caterpillar nibbling the candle of the black pine as it was growing in the spring, and he discovered that the tree regrew summer shoots. And so he pondered that, and the next year he cut them at different times of the year. He took several trees, and he discovered he can control the candle length and the needle length by the date at which he had cut. And it started a revolution in black pine technique. And he shared that with his friends, and that became embedded into bonsai tradition. That's maybe the clearest example, or one that many of us are familiar with, cutting the candles on our black pines, of how the anecdotal tradition works. Now, no scientific experiment was done. These were just little tests done in the backyard. Science is a very particular thing, right? It has several steps to it, and the last one is replication, and that one is mirrored in anecdotal evidence, and yet anecdote is not really sufficient enough if you were a scientist, which my father was. So I have a little bit of surrounding background with science. I didn't have much personal experience with science, but I often felt like I was raised by his colleagues in this sort of bubble, and it certainly informed my sort of worldview and connection with nature. I was a birder since I was 10 years old, and that came from one of his colleagues, actually. Yeah. So anyway, that was a long-winded answer to the first question.
Well, and it what always strikes me is I've always wondered, do I want to suggest that the opposite of science is anecdote? Because when we talk about the anecdotal tradition, it's far more replicable than, an anecdote might be telling you what I had for lunch and how the server spilled the food all over the table and I had to change before going to a meeting. That's an anecdote. And that's not the kind of thing we're basing our bonsai practice on. And so it feels very scientific. However, it's not that everything we're doing is.
That's right.
We don't begin with hypotheses every time we water. Well, let's see what happens if I water my tree today. But it's this funny thing where anecdote doesn't seem to carry the weight. And so I've always looked for what's a good term beyond tradition or anecdote that kind of describes the care with which and the strength of the replicability of the people whose cues we follow and that guide our own experimentations or tests as we look to learn, whatever's next.
Yeah, that's a good question. Anecdote it's almost a clumsy term. If as another example, the Chinese never had the scientific method back in antiquity. And yet their methods of investigation that did not include this several step process of the scientific method ended up inventing many of the things that we're really, really familiar with. And the list goes on and on and on and on. And yet it's actually surprised some scholars that they weren't the ones to come up with the scientific method, being Europeans who did.
Yeah, it's funny. There are very effective ways of being practical that aren't necessarily following the scientific method.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's a very narrow band of investigation. It's a powerful one, but it's also it has a kind of a wonderful flexibility to it, built in to it, which is that it's not really an investigation into like ultimate truth or anything, because it assumes in its methodology that it's only partway there, that an experiment is one sliver of a bigger piece of the puzzle, and it kind of leads you to a possible good next question. And so in that sense, you can't take it, as if it was sort of this written in stone sort of thing, because science isn't that either. I had a student of mine, a dentist, read Bonsai Heresy, and he wrote me a note. And he said, this reminds me of the first year that I was in dental school. And our first professor, there was this huge classroom, and everybody was sitting there with bated breath. And this professor said, 50% of what you learn in the next few years will be untrue. The problem is I have no idea what 50% that is. And that really shows off a lot of what, so that was the medical field, but it's based on science, really. So, and results from science. So, that we'll probably end up in a revision of Bonsai Heresy, because a chunk of it, I don't know, maybe 25% of it is weighs in with scientific studies, those that we do have, which relate to things like physiology and soils and things that are actually really, really interesting, hormones and things of that nature, how fertilizers affect crops and things like that. Some of these things are really, really well studied, but how, but it sort of informs bonsai technique rather than creates bonsai technique. Interestingly, many of the things that are used or assumed in bonsai technique from the tradition were actually ahead of some of the scientific knowledge. So the information around how sugars move around in relation to how hormones move around has only recently and fairly heretically been proposed in the scientific communities, that sugar is actually a more powerful indicator of where a tree is going to grow than previously thought hormones. So there's some, and that's a whole big deep hole of it we don't have to get into, but really interesting kinds of things that some of the partial defoliation, trimming a leaf in half, dampens the sugar production in one area and kind of balances the sugar production with a weaker area. I mean, this is what is now considered to be a really powerful predictor of plant growth. But that came from the tradition. The tradition was decades ahead of physiology thought. So anyway, one example.
I think you're kind of getting at one thing that can make the tradition so effective is science is one approach. Like I've always thought of it just as you described. It's less about providing answers than providing us with an approach to finding answers. And it's what's wonderful about the approach is it can be equally critical of itself as well as whatever it's producing along the way.
There's a lot of power in that.
There is. And it reminds me of something else you said. I heard a great quote recently, and I'll have to look up who it was from. It was actually an interview with a guy who was quoting his grandfather. And it was something like, we start with a perspective, we learn some things, and we end with a perspective. And the hope is that the perspective we end with is more accurate than the perspective we started with. And so it's less about being right or wrong or finding truth, and more about how can we guide ourselves toward accuracy along the way. And whether following tradition or the scientific method both get us toward that same end.
Right. And for me, it was interesting to have this background because I forgot about it for decades. I mean, having this growing up around scientists, and although I did have a biology minor in college, it was never really a direction for me. I was an artist, which creation is more like witchcraft. I mean, it's an entirely different thing. Although there is a lot of creativity in some of the really beautiful kinds of experiments that come out of science. So there's a link there. And yet, what I was doing was entirely different. It was only after getting deep into bonsai, and particularly running my own bonsai garden, that I started to dip back into sort of my roots. And back into science, and trying to figure out why things were not working in my backyard, and doing some kind of citizen science experiments in my backyard, and realizing what the difference was between a citizen science experiment and something that would happen in a lab and would be good enough to be published. And there's a big difference there. But I definitely went in a very different direction. This book was that part was fun. We'll talk later. I think you did have a question about why writing is difficult, but the real fun part of this was what was kind of melding something in deep past for me with what I'm doing in the present.
That's really cool. I wish I had grown up with that, which is funny because I grew up with in a nursery household. So if not with science, then with the brute fact of having plants around and having to keep plants healthy as just my starting point for engaging with things in the broader world, which was fun. But I did spend a number of years in academic publishing working with scientists. And by far the most fun part of that work was always interacting with the actual researchers themselves on how they come up with better questions and how they share that with the world. That was kind of what my role in that was. And it was a ton of fun. And so I've always found the whole concept or approach to sharing the results of experimentation as just a really comforting idea.
Yeah, yeah. It's a community of discoveries and inclinations toward discovery. That it was a lot of fun to be a part of. I didn't know that about you. I didn't know you were working with science and the results and the people who were working within science so directly. Oh, that's
I
interesting.
got really
Yeah,
lucky in that we had a number of
yeah.
PhDs on staff. They were the
Hmm.
editorial staff.
Ah,
And I often got to work with the editorial staff who would say, oh, we want to be able to share things this way, or we want to be able to
yeah, yeah.
make it easier for people to interact with what they're publishing in this other way. And so that's we would go into the specific examples and they would share their anecdotes about how these crazy projects were coming together. Plus I
Mm.
got to interview actually at both of the publishers I worked for. I got to do these big projects where I actually
Mm.
got to interview a lot of different researchers to ask them about the entire publishing process and how they share the information that they need to participate in their disciplines,
Mm. Mm. That
which was
would be.
fascinating. It was just so much fun.
I bet. I bet. I bet. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for
Yeah.
joining us on today's episode of Philosophy Today. That was a fascinating conversation.
Right, right, right. Yeah, we're all fans of Star Talk, by the way.
Exactly.
It's a really interesting podcast. I've been joking with our three other members of Bonsai Wire, because I'm not really a podcast listener. I've heard maybe 6 podcasts and maybe less than 20 total. So it's a little bit ironic that I'm actually a member of one or partly running one. But it is a fun medium. Enjoying it.
Oh, it's been fantastic.
Yeah, yeah. And I think this was your idea originally, wasn't it, Jonas?
Yeah, I kind of
think
snuck it into a conversation that Andrew and I had been
with Andrew,
having,
yeah,
and then
yeah.
we included you in that. And it's like, yeah, or we could just do it as a podcast. And so that after enough time, it ended up, that's how it popped up.
Oh, fun.
So tell
Onward.
me about long-term and short-term soil media.
Oh, wow. Okay. There's another
Total
wormhole.
change of pace. We're just going to the hard rocks that help
The hard rocks.
give the
Wow.
structure
Okay.
for everything.
Yeah. Bonsai Heresy starts off with this puzzle of long-term and short-term soil media, which was the only way I could come up with to describe this. For years, I was working with nursery soil components. I shouldn't say soil; it's media, right? Root media. What's in your pot is the more accurate term. And then that goes back decades. I've been doing bonsai 35 years. And for at least 20 of those years, I was working with all kinds of different soil media. And the early ones were the nursery ones. So this is heavily in the organic percentage, either peat moss or bark or something like that. Mixed with something that is usually called drainage, but is an aerator. So either something like pumice or vermiculite or perlite is another very common one in the nursery industry. The results that I had was that I had a great 1 or 2 years for many things, not all things. Conifer, especially pine, seemed to struggle with that kind of stuff, and I couldn't figure out why. And my assumption was whatever they used and everything flourished with should work great for what I was doing. But the problem was those soils are designed to grow a tree hard and strong, and bonsai media are designed to use bonsai technique and to slow a tree down. And that took me decades to figure out the difference between those. In fact, it was only when I started studying with Boone there in Alameda at his first house there, and later as an apprentice with Shinji Suzuki, that I had experience with these other methods, which ironically were the traditional methods. I mean, I had started on the other end. I had started with the radical stuff, the stuff that were because there was no akadama available. Nobody knew much about the other stuff that Japanese were using, which was lava and pumice. I mean, this was all in a different country. These soils they weren't even mythology. We didn't even know they existed. I mean, so when I first started studying with Boone and then with Suzuki, there was a big transformation in my thinking about soils, because I was able to see for the first time the core of the root ball become dense with fine roots and remain that way for a really, really long time. When I got to Japan, I discovered root balls that had been the core, the interior, so not the part you're cutting away when you're repotting, but the interior of that mass was viable for decades. And sometimes they never seemed to go in there and do anything. And they just shocked my pants off. I mean, I had never seen anything like that. And yet it created this really stable physiological foundation on which the tree could regrow following repotting. And I tried to lay that out in several of the initial chapters of Bonsai Heresy. And I must say that was probably the hardest bit to write about, because although I had been convinced in my own garden what was going on, I had to dig back and figure out why I was so confused to begin with. And I had forgotten. It was much like forgetting, my background in science. So anyway, that was a really challenging part of writing the book, for sure.
I know I was lucky in that my very first exposure to bonsai was with, I met Boone, which is what kicked it off. But the first organized events I went to were run by Kathy Shaner, who had just come back from Japan. So I started out on a contemporary Japanese path as I started learning back in 1993. That was 27 years ago. And so I was able to, having grown up in the nursery, I knew the nursery industry as a starting point, but bonsai was always this special thing, in quotation marks, that was treated this other way. And so I know that your experience lines up far better with, every other person in the country and how they've learned bonsai. But it's interesting, because I remember the very early days when it was harder to find akadama, or didn't know what kunuma was at the time. And I would grow azaleas in a mix of half bark and half lava. And I found, wow, it had spectacular results. I could make those azaleas scream out of the pot. It was awesome. But what would those trees have looked like, 5, 10, 15 years later in that mix? I don't know. I know what bark looks like after 15 years. It's kind of a black sludge. And so everything you're saying about that long-term and short-term both informs how awkward so many of our soil media discussions are, because we're not talking about our goals in why we're using a soil as much as we're talking about, well, I use this or I want to use that. And I've always loved the idea of let's line up our approaches with the goals. And so by even mentioning the topic of, by giving us chapter 1, you're talking about, here's how we're going to talk about science and tradition. And chapter 2 is, what is this concept of long-term and short-term, permanent versus temporary? More philosophical ideas that kind of inform the core of what is it that's making bonsai different from these other things we grow in containers or in the ground.
And this is a great example, although we have lots of studies, of research about how soil interacts with plant growth, or creates plant growth. What we don't have is the question that I raise in, what is it, chapter 3, where we start talking about this inner core and longevity. I mean, we don't have any studies about that because scientists are not interested in it. It's, it doesn't move great economic levers like crop production. It's, so we have to have a little bit of humility around, we can't stamp our foot, when we don't have studies that represent what we actually want to have answered. You started talking about bark and how that breaks down into a black sludge. And this is the second part of the equation, and why I was not having success with these nursery soils that then stay a long time, much longer in a bonsai pot than if you have this yew or pine or azalea that you're going to put in the ground, which is, or maybe in a huge, deck container. That's the end result or placement of a nursery plant. But a bonsai stays in a bonsai pot indefinitely. And so that interior core is critical because of this black sludge you're talking about. If you're using an organic soil, it is going to decompose. And what the problem that I was having then was that after a few years, the roots would primarily be growing around the sides and the bottom. And then I would be reading my books and they say, okay, you cut the sides and the bottom and you replace in the pot. And I would just cut all the roots off the tree and the tree died. So it was actually a combination of two things that didn't work together. One of them was from the tradition, the repotting technique of cutting the sides and the bottom. That is an accurate technique. However, I was using a different soil, and so were so many other people that didn't create this inner core that would allow the tree to survive such an operation. So it took me a long time to put that all into words, which is why this is, I mean, it sounds simple now that I'm saying it, but it was a fight to figure out how to actually say all this. But that's how the book begins, and I hope it doesn't turn too many people off, because I know we're so married to the soils that we use. And that's where, later in the book, we talk a little bit about anchoring, which is familiar in the medical profession, where a doctor will get a prognosis. I hope I'm using the right word of a problem, and then further tests actually lean in a different direction. The doc can't get rid of this anchor he has to his first idea of what he's seeing. And we have that same problem. Our first initial sort of embryonic experience with soil and many other types of technique, really, we end up being kind of semi-married to those things, and it's really hard to give that up. And I think we're all hardwired to do that. It's not like we're bad people, but it's a function. It does function. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's nothing at all to that topic, clearly. Yeah.
But no, and we couldn't fill out several podcasts just for that one.
And you did presage my next question, which was, how can one tell if there are problems in the core of the root ball?
Oh, wow. Well, obviously, if your tree dies when you repotted it, that's a clue. But I only partly jest, because that is a likely clue. But the inner core is a tricky zone, because even in the best situation, so you have a porous volcanic media, which is what the Japanese media is primarily, Akadama pumice lava. And some people don't use the lava at all. That's a different part of a conversation, maybe. Deciduous trees don't care for lava that much, but we can talk about that later. In any event, this core, if it's packed full of roots, it's going to dry out. So if it's drying out, it can also get bone dry. So if it gets bone dry, then when you water your tree, it can look dry 15 minutes later, and you can think you're losing your mind. But it's actually that the core that is so active with roots that you can end up inadvertently drying out the inner core, having spent so much time trying to activate the density of it with fine roots. You can end up with parts of it dying because of lack of moisture on the interior, and then you get root rot. So being sure that the inner core is hydrated is super important. And one of those clues is whether it's drying out in a predictable, takes a day to dry out or something. That would assume that inner core is being hydrated. But on the other hand, if it dries out in a few minutes on a warm day, that's a clue that there might be some problem in the inner core. And there are other problems as well, but that's just one that came to mind.
Oh, yeah. I had an oak tree that dried out way faster than I ever would have expected for how little foliage it had on it. It did just what you described. And I was watering it every day, and it kept drying out. And after watering it one time, and by watering it, this is filling up the pot 3 times with water and watching it with my eyes drained down. And then I scratched below the surface and it was dry, not that far
Yeah.
down at all. I took a
Yes.
screwdriver, poked holes in the root
Yes.
ball, watered it.
Useful
It
tool.
didn't dry out for 4 days. And that was the normal periodicity for watering, was about every 4
Right.
days at the time for that tree.
Right. Right. Yeah, and any soil can kind of create this hydrophobia that we're talking about. Although some soils, even if they aren't dense, like we're talking about that inner core, if they're completely loose, if you've just potted your tree, there's some soils that can create this scrape the surface and underneath is bone dry situation. And one of the worst of those are the fired clay products that are kind of flattish. Turfus is one of those. That's a terrifying experience. You just potted your tree up, you water it, you can stand there for 5 minutes watering this thing, and then you scratch the surface and it's bone dry underneath. Try that if you're using that product. Give it a whirl. That almost the only way to actually hydrate that is from the bottom up the first time that you water. And then help us if that ever dries out completely, because then that'll continue to be kind of hydrophobic. So there are some particles that have more problem. Particles that aren't flat is a good clue. Something that isn't necessarily round, but is at least irregular, helps, as many of the volcanic particles are. Yeah, but that's I'm glad you mentioned that one, because that's a serious issue. It can happen with organic soils as well, but it's less likely for them. And then we've been banging organic pretty hard here, and I don't mean to, because we're assuming we're talking about bonsai in pots. So we're if not a developed tree, if not a mature tree, we're on our way. But if you're growing trees, if you enjoy working on what we call pre-bonsai, or something that you're growing a trunk, or developing branch taper and things of this nature, you might well want to use an organic based soil. As I do, I use one in what I call the back 40, which are all of these trees that are kind of on the way to find out. They're nowhere near a bonsai pot yet. And they will grow a stronger, more not healthy, but a more physiologically active, charging ahead kind of plant than if you use the volcanic media. They hold more moisture, they hold more nutrition, and they have enough air in them. So in a nursery pot, using soils like bark and pumice and things of this nature, or perlite, can be incredible. You can have amazing results. So I don't use expensive imported soils from Japan to grow plants on.
And the interesting question would be is, if we continue to use that soil throughout a tree's life, we might be able to keep it alive for just as long, but it might be a different story if we want to facilitate the characteristics that we most prize in older, mature bonsai: the shorter internodes, the smaller leaves, the very slow growth, without which it's impossible to get the characteristics that at least some people prize in bonsai.
Right. Yeah, if our goals is to keep something alive and healthy and growing strongly, there's a million soil media you can use. But these short internodes that you just mentioned, and bark is a feature of age. And if we're growing a tree hard, we're going to flake bark off. The tree is going to look young. If you take an old bonsai, a 200-year-old pine, and you put it in the ground, from 2 feet, it's going to shoot up to 65 feet. It's going to lose all its bark. And, I mean, they don't deal with age the same way that we do. They can kind of become young again. And we can, if we mischoose our soils and mismanage our fertilizing, or even, and to some degree, our watering, we can completely transform an old tree into a young one. But we can also go the other way. And by careful choices, we can enhance the characteristics of age.
Well, tell us more about that, because that topic comes up a lot in the book and it doesn't get a full description. And that is, it'll make our tree look young, or it'll make it grow like a young tree. And so what
Sure. Yeah.
Not everyone might be familiar with the concept of what we mean when we're saying a bonsai, it no longer looks like an old tree. It's like, well, what do you mean? The trunk's still 8 inches across and there's all this
Right.
great deadwood. It looks, how can it not look like an old tree?
Yeah. Great conversation. We tend to equate, thickness with age, and yet a bunjin is assumed to be an old tree. So it has this, what I think is a fascinating kind of contradiction between a thin trunk tree and yet it has craggy bark on it. So usually we think of a thick trunk tree and we gravitate to the thick trunk tree because it indicates age. And yet if you have a plant, just to make one example, that's just come out of the ground, it might well have a 10-inch trunk pine, and yet it might not have even lost its what's called first bark. So bark on a pine has several different characteristics. The first is it's cracking off the smooth part that it had, when it was really quite young. And underneath that is bark that is striated vertically, and that's your mature bark. And yet to create that, we have to be sure that that we're not over fertilizing. So if you give a plant a lot of root run, or if you repot too frequently, if you use too much fertilizer, you're going to create a very, very active cambium layer. And that active cambium layer is going to create a lot of phloem. It's going to create a really large vascular transport system. And if you do that, you're going to crack any bark off that you have, including, if you have it, any of the second bark, the old looking bark. The things that we want on a mature bonsai. So that's just one example.
So we're ageist, is what you're saying.
Oh, that's terrible, Jonas. I can't believe you said that on a podcast. I guess we are. I think you're right.
I have a ponderosa pine that I've hardly fertilized it this year, but I've been watering it, and I gave it really good soil for the first time. And I've got these giant yellow-orange cracks in between the older plates of bark, because the thing, apparently ponderosa pines can grow really vigorously in the Bay Area. And yeah, it's behaving like a young tree, longer inner nodes. And I needed to get it healthy. It was in really bad shape and had almost no roots before, but now it's like, okay, I never need you to grow that fast ever again.
Oh, yeah. Yes. The pine is one example, but the same thing could happen with a spruce, could happen.
And we're ignoring deciduous trees, which are the most obvious example. As soon as you get a single long internode, I was at the Kokofu show this year, and I got to see one of the top masters, Takayama, for deciduous trees, and he had a couple awesome items in the show, and I could not help but notice some really strong growth near the tops of these amazing old trident maple groves. And that just tells you how hard it is to rein in the growth on a healthy tree. I mean, this was a spectacular 3-foot tall, huge grove of trident maples, and the growth was borderline unacceptably coarse up near the top.
Right. And this was something I just segues into a conversation I had with my friend Gary Wood recently, who's done a lot of pondering about bonsai and physiology. And one thing he has noted is that if a bonsai is in a pot so long and you apply good bonsai technique to them, you're creating these really short internodes, and that cambium layer and the phloem layer are getting thinner and thinner and thinner, and we're, everything's looking amazing and we're loving it, and the ramification is crazy. And the problem then is that it can get slowed down so far that then it doesn't quite have enough energy to support what it has. And then you kind of need to give it a little break for a little bit. So there might even be years, and there are very few. I mean, I don't have any trees really like this in my backyard yet. They're not developed enough. But in Japan, there are years when you give a tree just a hair of a break, and you might let slip some of these things that we're encouraging you to do in order to grow your tree just a little bit harder, and then back it off again the next year. But for the most part, I think to go back to pines, ponderosa, for instance, some of the single flush plants, ponderosa, Japanese maple, another single flush plant. There's several others in the deciduous camp, but these plants, many Westerners, I feel, fertilize far too much once they're in a bonsai pot, so that you get long needles on the pines, the single flush pines. You get really long internodes on the Japanese maples, and there's no way to control this. And we begin to have youthful characteristics. And not only that, but we begin to have trouble creating ramification, which is what you get when you begin to slow things down and begin to minimize the size of those apical buds on these trees. So it's a dance between a whole bunch of variables, and I don't find it easy. I think it's really tricky to balance your environment, your climate, your fertilizing levels, how big a pot you're growing it in. All these things are variables that can influence aesthetics. They can influence what our plants look like, whether they look young or whether they look old.
And depending on the techniques and the aesthetics you're going for, I totally agree. Those are just super challenging things if your goal is to produce that highest level of refinement. And if your goal is anything else, it's almost not even an issue. But if you really are looking at how do we most adorn the trunks of these spectacular old deciduous trees, it's with that really tightly ramified short internode growth. And that's just super hard. I have found one example actually of a couple categories of trees that are refined enough in the States that we do need to back off. One is, in California, there's a whole bunch of trees that have been started decades ago, and they've been kept in borderline too small show pots for most of those decades. They're ready for a break. And that's a lot of different species. They need to grow a little bit. They need to relax. They need to follow your trick of putting it in a big box with some pumice around it. Any of those things to let them stretch out a little bit and grow. But there's
I'm sorry. There's a lot of power behind growing a tree on your bench, a mature bonsai, in not a show pot, but a pot that's 1 or 2 inches bigger. So it's not the box of pumice, which is for a really weak tree or a sick tree or something like that I recommend, but it's something that allows this just a little bit of extra physiology. And this is also assuming, physiological advantage, growing a little bit stronger. That this is assuming that we're not over fertilizing in the spring and we're not. Fall fertilization is really your important time. It's not that we shouldn't be fertilized during the growing season, but I think most Westerners overdo it. And we don't fertilize enough in the fall because the plant in the spring is using minerals that it's stored from the fall. It isn't really taking up a lot of minerals in the springtime. It's using the stuff it already has in it to push out growth in the spring. That segues into the nitrogen question.
Yeah, I see the same thing. I see far more people bring in trees to workshops that are too weak to work on, not too strong. Like, it's rare that I see trees that are too strong. I mean, it definitely happens regularly, but when everything else is perfect, the tree's old. In other words, by the time you get everything else lined up, you've probably dialed in the fertilizing a bit.
Right. And this just shows how difficult it is. I mean, Jonas is seeing things that are too weak, and they're either too ramified, they're in too small a pot for too long a time. And I'm finding people bringing in trees that are Yamadoris that have been collected 3 years ago, and they've been pumped full of fertilizer in a big box, and they're like, teenagers again.
Yeah.
And balance is hard.
And so balance is that key word. So the other time I'm finding a way to back off has only come up with when you do a lot of culture of something like a pine, where you have a technique like decandling. So I've joked for years that one of the miracles of a pine that you can decandle is you get pine math, which is you can double the branches every year. And within 4 years, every one branch can turn into 16. The first year it goes to 2, then 4, 8, 16. Well, very quickly, you can imagine that pot's not going to push 798 little branch tips on it. And so
Right.
I have found that it's actually really important when you get to the right density, you need to start doing quite a lot of cutback and fall to allow the tree to grow if you're going to expect a reasonable response. And I'm already at the point with a lot of trees where, and these are young, not even 20 years old yet, where I'm happy to get one bud per decandled shoot, or I'm going to need to do quite a lot of cutback to expect a borderline reasonable response from the tree.
That's
Because
such an
I've made
important
trees too
point.
weak, and I have learned it actually doesn't take that many years of so technique, and you've already maxed out the doubling you can get out of a tree.
Yeah, that is such a critical comment for those who have mature trees. It doesn't go to infinity.
No.
The shoot has to have room to grow. And not only that, there is a limit, and it's limited by how many fine, small roots can grow in that pot.
Yep.
That's what supports the top. The tree is going to balance itself. And if it can't do that, if you're forcing it to create more ramification using some of these powerful techniques that we use and that Jonas just talked about with the black pine decandling, you're going to double your number every time. If it can't support that, it's going to start making its own decisions. It's going to start killing some things off, and or the whole tree will get weak. And that's not what we want. We want to be making the decision. So the clue to this is be really attentive to your fall work, because fall trimming, shoot selection on many different trees, black pine is a great example, sets up what happens in the spring. And we have to make enough room for what is going to show up in the little space of several cubic inches. What is in this part of the tree? How much foliage can this tree actually support? And that there's a density limit. A really good point that you're making.
Yeah, I'm finding black pine just coincidentally turned out to be a fantastic model organism for bonsai.
It is.
I
You
think
learn so much, and how challenging black pine is and how easy so many other trees are.
Yeah. On the deciduous side, I think Japanese maple is a great model organism, because if you can learn how to wrangle growth on a Japanese maple, you can pretty much do anything.
Yeah.
They're hard.
They are.
You have to
They
grow it right
truly
the
are.
first time, or you don't have it, period. Pretty much most other species they have some bit of forgiveness baked in, but those things are tough.
Love it. Love it.
Well, you
Love it.
set up the growth, and again, you brought it back to the soil and the roots. And I'm curious, how many mixes do you think you use in your garden? How many different soil mixes at any given time?
Two primary ones. Well, three, if I count something that I've just collected or whatnot. That's usually in pure sifted pumice. It's maybe 1/4 inch pumice or something. That's in a box. But two primary ones, the back 40 that I mentioned with bark and pumice. It's the bark is actually mixed. There's a little bit of steer manure in it, which gives this long lasting 2 to 3 years of very slow release fertilizer. We're still fertilizing, but that's a nice background fertilizer. And those are in like nursery pots and flats and deciduous trees, but also, young Itoigawas and things like that we're playing with from cuttings. And it grows a tree really strong. So it's like 80% of this bark steer and then 20% pumice. And that's a really strong mix. And then if it's in a bonsai pot, it's going to have akadama and pumice in it. I don't use lava. Neither did my teacher Suzuki. Now, lava is fairly scoria. That is a fairly common ingredient in Japan and in the West. You can definitely use it. The conifers tend to have a much greater ability to manage any kind of overdose of sort of toxicity from minerals, but deciduous have a far less ability to do that. And because Suzuki had maybe 25% of his bonsai in Japan were deciduous trees, he just left the love out entirely. So I changed the mix a little bit according to what I'm doing. It might only be 30% akadama. For some pines, and the rest is pumice. And then I cover the top with sphagnum moss. And I do layer. I keep smaller particles on the top. just to keep an even moisture level throughout the pot. But a deciduous tree, I might include more akadama, maybe 50%. Akadama is expensive, I think in a perfect world, maybe I'd be using 70% or more. In Japan, there's a couple species that use 100% akadama, like beech. But then they're repotting every 3 years. It's not like the compaction becomes a problem if you have 100%, if you have a rapid repotting cycle. But anyway, that's what I use. It's really two mixes.
It's two mixes, but one of those mixes, it sounds like you're using a bunch of different percentages. So it sounds like there's several mixes.
That's right.
In one of those mixes.
Correct. That's correct, according to what I might use. And a moisture-loving conifer, like some of the spruces, hemlock, I will use kind of a deciduous mix, so maybe 50% akadama. Akadama holds a little more moisture than the pumice does, but it's surprising what you can grow in pure pumice. You can grow an azalea in pure pumice. It has a lot of porosity and pretty good moisture retention, but an incredible amount of oxygen. It's a very porous particle. Roots respire so the plant grows stronger. If you use too much pumice, your plant's going to be too strong. One thing I've noticed is that the pumice that they use in Japan is much heavier. It's much denser. It's harder. There's much less gas exchange in it. And the pumice that we have from the Pacific Northwest of the United States is incredibly light. Some of it can almost float on the surface of the water. It's almost perlite. And I find that if you have too much pumice in your mix, your plants can grow almost too strong. So it's a great soil for a collected conifer because it keeps the original soil mass kind of dry. If you leave it in there too long, you can get a really strong tree if you're not careful. They don't need an awful lot of fertilizer.
What's funny is I have found that I can't make pines turn green if there's too much pumice in the mix, or if it's a pumice only mix.
Yes,
that's another topic, but I've put a solid inch of fertilizer on top of pumice mixes, and I still can't turn the pines green. And so I use a ton of pumice as well, and really prefer our domestic pumice over the Japanese stuff. The Japanese pumice is, although a better color, it's too round.
It's gray.
It doesn't have the irregularity as much as ours does. But yeah, I can't keep pines green in it, and I don't know what I'm doing wrong.
It's an interesting comment. I've noticed that too, and I'm on the verge of switching up what I'm doing too. It might be the iron in the akadama, or I don't really know what the greening is. If there's a lack of I don't know, magnesium. I mean, magnesium is an important molecule for chlorophyll. Element in the molecule of chlorophyll. Sorry. Yeah.
When you were in Japan, did you ever deal with trees that were potted in what I think of as one of the most common mixes from all the growers down in Shikoku? And I don't know if you know what I'm referring to, but a lot of the pine growers down there, or conifer growers, use 100% sand.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's and I don't remember if that's the Kawasuna or the Yamasuna, but whether the trees are in the ground or in containers, they use, our closest equivalent would be 100% decomposed granite.
Yeah. And I know some growers who use that here in the West as well, granite. I've never actually had any of that Japanese soil in my hand, but you're saying it's a lot like decomposed granite. It's
those sharper squared. Yeah, exactly. Tiny bit of microporosity, not much to speak of, but just they control the moisture by particle size. It's a hot and humid part of Japan, so they're getting less cold in winter, so the heat sink's less of an issue. They're getting a ton of heat and humidity and rain in the summer, and it's not holding on to extra moisture. But I was shocked to see it in the ground and in containers, and no one can say those trees aren't healthy. 100% sand.
Yeah, and a particular kind of sand. I think you'd have less good luck if you used pure quartz. But then, as you said, soil size is critical. That helps a lot because it introduces oxygen. Sand is a funny particle. On the small size, it's one of the very best ways to start a cutting. So because as I was talking about this with Gary Wood, and he said one of the primary things it offers is water. And I never thought of that, but it's absolutely accurate, because if you have a small size particle of sand, it has a lot of capillarity. And so you start your cutting in it. But then interestingly, as Gary mentioned, after several weeks, pretty soon you're cutting that's in a different kind of media. Many different kinds of media, can have organic, can have volcanic, is going to overtake the one in sand, because those offer a lot of other things. They offer more nutrition and more air. Important.
The air is crucial.
So it's really interesting. It's like a bunch of runners. So if you imagine, like, if you've got your soil media up, at the starting line, and one of them is fine sand, and the others are your volcanic media and your organic media and whatever, and the sand is going to take off like a bullet, and it's going to tire itself out. And these others are going to pass it after about 100 yards. They're going to whip around and they're going to win the 400. So this is why I think when you make your black pine cuttings, these old photographs of these little lines, I mean, it looks like these beautiful little cultivated rows, in a flat, and you have all these little black pine seedling cuttings stuck in pure sand, and then surrounding that is normal bonsai soil. So the roots grow through the sand, they have this great start, and then they hit the other soil where they get more oxygen and more nutrition, and bam, the thing is off and running. So it's like it has that great first 100 meters, and then the roots are into these other soil mixes, and it continues to whip around the track, and it flat out wins the race.
Yeah,
so anyway.
That's exactly what I've seen. And a sidebar to that is, when I've repotted those seedling cuttings out of the 4-inch pot with a little pocket of sand in the middle, there will be two things going on in that pocket of sand. There will be 0 roots inside there, and it'll usually be a dry brick. The water just goes right around it, and because it can flow so easily through the larger particles of whatever it is we're using, whether bark or pumice or lava. And it really does help you out of the gates, and that's about it.
Yeah.
It's funny stuff.
Yeah. But once you increase the size of it, and of course it's a little bit of a different particle in Japan, it's a bit more like decomposed granite, which is much better than pure quartz. Once you increase the size of it, you're increasing your oxygen. And then you can grow a lot of things in it. It's a little bit of a heat sink though. I mean, it's really going to hold on to your heat in the summer, but conifers like that. They're like some amount of it. You can really increase root growth. So it depends on where you live. It depends on how you're managing, how you're watering, how you're fertilizing, and it's surprising what you can use. You can use all kinds of things to grow bonsai, and of course those aren't bonsai. They're growing things on. But the ones in Japan that you're talking about, these pines.
Yeah, and a heat sink would probably be a good thing for me, because unlike so much of the country where there's high humidity and the temperatures may not change a lot between day and night, I get cold nights where I live. And so maybe I'd get a lot happier roots if I could preserve more of the day's heat at night.
Yeah, throw that pumice out. Yeah, pumice is an insulator.
I've used a lot of decomposed granite in mixes over the years, and I'm curious to use it again.
Get back to us on that. I'm curious.
I've never seen any untoward results from it, and so other than it's heavy.
Yeah. I've seen the backcountry guys, backcountry bonsai, Steve Varlin and Dan, I'm going to mangle his last name, I'm sorry, Dan W. We call you Dan W. Wiedering. Some of the first plants I got for them were in 100% decomposed granite, and they were great. I mean, the box weighed, I needed help to pick up the box, but I mean, those guys are strong. But the trees were great. They were healthy. There were no problems with the roots when we took them out. And I know others, including Larry Jackal in the Denver area, use decomposed granite, and others have.
All over Southern California, a lot of Northern California, a lot of the old school was using a lot of decomposed granite for junipers and pines and whatnot.
Yeah, and it's cheap. I mean, this is local stuff. Yeah, it might be not so cheap, if you live in Illinois where there isn't any granite. But anyway.
So weather had come up along the way in there, and it made me want to mention a weather-related thing in climate, because we have nominal seasons in the Bay Area, and everyone's thinking about, these concepts of dormancy, and they're more intellectual concepts where I live. And I'm curious, what would you tell someone who's looking to use a refrigerator either for evenings
Oh,
or
wow.
winter cooling?
Oh, wow. Yeah, this is something I've never had a client work with that. I've never lived in a climate like you're talking about. Even when I lived in Arizona, I was living up kind of in the mountains, really, and we had cool nights. So I didn't have to do that. But I think light would be the thing that I would be curious to investigate with that question. So we have the cooling, right? We have the refrigerator idea. Several things come to mind. One is ventilation. You don't want what we have to store, our lettuce for bonsai, because eventually we're going to get molds in there. So that one, you're going to need fans. You're going to need some way of venting out the humidity. And then light is the other one, because unless it's fully dormant, most plants need some amount of light. So even if you're, in the high 30s or something, a plant might need a little something. When I lived in upstate New York, it was incredibly cold when I was in graduate school up there. I was a potter years ago, and that's what I was doing up there. But anyway, I had this small bonsai collection. I would dig a pit and I would throw the trees in there, and then I would cover it with plywood. So they were in darkness forever, but it was incredibly cold. The pots were frozen for days on end. I did a lot of things wrong. It's not that pots can't freeze if they're bonsai, if it's a hardy plant, and the dormancy cascade is started, and you're not in the middle of summer when this happens. But if it stays frozen for a long time, it can be a bit of a problem for hydration to the plant. And so I'm just running through some of the things that I've gone through for anybody who's thinking about refrigerating their plant, to maybe keep in mind. But the problem is that then when they begin to wake up in the spring, they're growing in the darkness. So that's where light would come into play. Your photo period and your intensity of light. Those are the questions that I think you would want to do some experimentation around.
I know a couple people that have used them to really good effect, and
oh, really?
I've literally been thinking about it lately to the degree of, apart from the expense, like what's the carbon footprint of where your municipality gets their electricity? Because,
yeah, right. If it's hydro, you're good.
Yeah, or if you have solar or something
or
like
solar,
that.
yeah.
Because it's
Right.
it's interesting whether to provide the nighttime cooling that's so helpful to people where it doesn't cool down at night, or to provide some actual chill time. I think the lowest recorded temperature Alameda's had this year was either 30 or 33, somewhere in that neighborhood, and that was one day. And so I cannot offer chilling hours here, and I often will send trees up to a friend who lives in the foothills who can overwinter some of the trees that appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is an important question. There is a chapter in Bonsai Heresy where I talk about an adventure I had with a client of mine down in LA that was very close to the coast. And his temperate trees were failing after a few years. For 1 or 2 years, they did fine. Then they started failing. We thought, oh, it must be just, the winter cooling. That's a real problem. And then we brought them up north in the middle of the growing season. We brought them up to Oregon, all these trees that were failing down there. We had things like cryptomeria and quince. And we brought them up. And I think it was May when we brought them up. And within 1 or 2 months, they looked like different trees. I mean, they had completely different energy, and that totally threw that idea into the wastebasket, that winter cold was the only thing that these plants needed. Obviously, there was something else going on there. And I did offer an idea in that chapter. I don't know if it's the full story. I think I talked with Linda Chalker-Scott, who is a horticulturalist. I interviewed her. And in that interview, I got the sense that there are a lot of complex things at play here, and that it might not be so simple. The idea that I threw out was of this sort of day length. day to night chill. So not seasonal chill, but daily chill. How far is the drop from daytime to nighttime temperature? And the best idea I could come up with is that it just wasn't enough of a bump down in LA, whereas in Oregon we had more. It wasn't a lot. It was only like 5 degrees, but it seemed to be enough. And you wouldn't think that would be enough, but until you start to think about desert climates where that temperature swing is like 50 degrees, and you think, oh, well, then the trees must be so much healthier then if this is an important thing. But other things are there in play where other stresses come in. So there's a lot going on here. Linda talked about them trying to grow apple crops down in Taiwan, which is much of the country is tropical, and the failure of that. I mean, they just couldn't create the kind of vigor that they could create in climates that had a distinct day to night cooling. So it's a very interesting topic, and I don't think that's the end of that. I don't think that chapter, gave a definitive answer, but I did enjoy telling the story of sharing the story of well, gosh, maybe it isn't just winter chill. Maybe there's more to it.
I think the chapter
that's not to say winter chilling wouldn't help. I think it does a lot. Yeah.
The chapter did a fantastic job of suggesting, because you point out the 3 different kinds of dormancy that we know of that people have researched, and that they each have their different triggers, and that each can protect against different kinds of harm that a tree could suffer if it grows at the wrong time. It's monitoring temperature, it's monitoring light, and it's monitoring these more frequent periodic changes, and that each one can provide different kinds of protection, and that there are also different levels of dormancy, and that at deeper levels of dormancy, trees are much stronger against those radical changes. And so the natural system, what you did a good job of telling us is that it's complex and that it's pretty darn practical.
Yeah, right. It has real life issues. One thing, and this is segueing into another chapter, which for me was a really interesting one to research because I didn't really know the answer to it. And there were several that I'll share, but this one I'm thinking about is about root hardiness.
Yes,
and that one, I hope that one will be useful to people because it sure was for me. I mean, when I was starting out in bonsai, I would just take the hardiness of the tree as you found in your garden book. Zone 5, great. I can grow these trees. I can't grow those trees. But unfortunately, that's really far away from reality because the garden book is assuming the tree's in the ground, whereas bonsai, we have something in a pot that is influenced by the ambient temperature. And roots are much more susceptible to cold than tops by tens of degrees, talking in Fahrenheit. So that was a fun chapter. And one of the things I wanted to talk about in this, is that at the end of that chapter, we begin to talk about hardiness. And you made me think of the example of black pine as compared with white pine. And we've always been taught that Japanese white pine is much hardier than Japanese black pine. And it's true, but only in part, because if you look up the hardiness of those two plants, Japanese black pine, Japanese white pine, they're identical. But if you look at how that works in practice, it isn't quite true. And so what this clues us in is that the Japanese white pine is growing in a really cold environment, and the triggers for full dormancy cascade that ends up in full dormancy, using these 3 kinds of dormancy that Jonas just mentioned, that it's working differently for that plant than the Japanese black pine, which is from a lower elevation and probably isn't reading the same signals. And so it is becoming damaged at lower temperatures in the fall or the spring when the white pine is not. So even though those two are, the same zone hardiness, they actually in the real world, especially when grown out of their natural environment, can become damaged by the environment that we're living in.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating example. I think the 2 degrees are, you have 10 degrees and negative 20 degrees are the
right
are the watch temperatures on them. And we all know, based on where they grow in nature, way high up in the mountains for white pines, along the ocean for black pines. And that's making a pretty strong case for how dormancy can offer some radical protection.
Yeah.
But that's only half of it, because that's the top of the tree and not
Mm-hmm.
the bottom of the tree, which is why I've recommended the book just for that one chapter. And just to spell it out for those who haven't seen it, Michael has listed a chart based on research that shows what temperatures at which we can expect the top of a tree to die, or what temperatures we can expect the roots to die for a given species popularly grown as bonsai. And it is the one really easy to use index for that information that's out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that came out of OSU, Oregon State University, and was research done by a couple of folks there. It wasn't published. It was so this might actually be the first time it was in print, but I was allowed to use that information from Iseli Nursery. Joe Harris helped me a lot with this. We had some really interesting conversations about how their temperature caps and bottoms of what they were growing, and how over the years they adjusted those according to what they were actually seeing in terms of their winter kill. And he made the point that study, which I have in Bonsai Heresy, the list that Jonas is talking about, is assumed to be in nursery containers, and bonsai are in much smaller containers, really, than that proportionally. And so Joe Harris recommends a much more conservative number, and I did adjust those with what Iseli uses for their numbers. Not their number crunching. It all comes down to number crunching, this stuff. Anyway, it was a fun chapter to read. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Jonas. It was a fun one to dig into. There were a few of those that surprised me. I think one of the most interesting stories to relate was one that I didn't know, which was about B1, the growth, supposed growth enhancer B1, which I'd always been a little suspicious of, but I really didn't know the answer to this. And it took me a long time to figure out why this thing that was sold by millions of companies and has made so much money over the decades doesn't actually work. And I feel so hesitant to say that, but I ended up having to purchase an article in a scholarly journal that gave the story of this, and I related it in the book, but in brief, this goes all the way back to the late 30s, where there was a researcher who thought he had discovered a new hormone, and unfortunately, this got a very small little billing in Better Homes and Gardens magazine, which created a bit of excitement. And then the next year, there was a several-page article featuring this guy and what he was studying, and it became this huge rage immediately. And unfortunately, the guy, within a year or two, had disproven his initial assumptions, but that never got into the news. So here we have this huge group, and these companies would be selling B1 forever because everybody's talking about it, and that it's a growth enhancer, and for those that aren't familiar with it, wonderful. B1 is supposedly a product that helps reduce transplanting stress. So you soak your roots in it or something like that. But it's a
wonderful story.
Snake oil, really. Yeah. It's a great story, and there's a lot of detail in the chapter. It was fun to discover that one. I think we should take a short break.
Yeah, so we can take a little break to hear from our sponsor if you need be, John.
Yeah, I'm starting to lose some blood sugar. So we can keep talking if you want, but I want to.
Yeah, go for it. I think, just 2 more technical questions and then the book questions. That's it.
Do you ever return home from a long trip to the store to find your bonsai wilted beyond repair? Do your trees not look as green as they should? Have your accent plants never looked as nice as the ones you see on Instagram? Maybe it's time to try dihydrogen monoxide. Dihydrogen monoxide is proven to increase the uptake of nutrients, help reduce stress, keep your plants hydrated longer, and much more. You might not know that professionals around the world use dihydrogen monoxide multiple times a day to keep their trees looking best. It is largely an unknown secret that we at Bonsai Wire are bringing into the light. We're excited to announce an exclusive partnership with the makers of dihydrogen monoxide. Every bottle sold off of our website comes with a money-back guarantee. If your trees do not look better, stronger, and happier within hours of using our product, we'll send your money back, no questions asked. Don't delay. Go to bonsaiwire.com/products and enter the code WIRE to receive a free bottle for a friend with every purchase while supplies last. Again, that's bonsaiwire.com/products. Enter the code WIRE. Thank you for your support.
Welcome back. Thank you for that. Next question. What watering advice do you have for someone who goes to work in the morning, comes back in the evening, and has no more than 2 opportunities to provide H2O for their trees?
Yeah, that's a really a situation so many find themselves in. And there's several ways you can handle it. Some people do increase water holding particle in their soil. They use a little more moss on top. They might position their plants a little bit so that during the heat of the day, there's a bit more shade. But still, hydration in the middle of the day, especially if one lives in a really hot climate, that can suggest sort of alternative watering. So although in the book I hit automatic watering systems pretty hard, this is one situation where it could really give an advantage. So either kind of a drip line or kind of a spray system that are used. Both of those are used in nursery situations. They can give your more water-loving plants, excuse me, the edge that they might really need in the middle of the day when it's hotter. So that's something to consider. Also, mist systems can, if your water quality is really good, can cool down areas during the hot part of the day. You can put them on a timer maybe. That can also reduce the need for water in the pot. Yeah.
Do you have some suggestions for things to do kind of mid-season, short of doing the full investment? They can maybe tide someone over until the next year when they can put in a system or change the soil or do anything?
Yeah, bigger pots.
Well, I mean, things you can do middle of the season. Like say it's July and someone's looking for something.
Yeah. Shade cloth is probably your biggest ambient temperature benefactor. I think these alternative hydration methods could be done mid-season, it's true. Taking something out of a pot and putting it into a bigger one, or that you can do that with some plants. Other pot configurations make that really, really challenging. Mm-hmm. You could, I don't know if you could hire somebody for that one season, for the middle of the day watering. That's always tricky to involve our family members in these activities. They might do so grudgingly, or if you're lucky, they might love it. But that's worked for many people. It's a very tricky dance, the middle of the day water and in the middle of the growing season, the real high heat time. Shade will help you a lot.
Yeah, even just moving it to another part of the garden can make a big difference.
Yep. Micro positioning. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, now time for a selfish question, which really stems from a discussion you have in chapter 23. But when you're using an injector system to fertilize, how do you manage trees that have different fertilizer needs?
Oh, yeah.
I'm just curious how you've dealt with that in your garden. I know what it's been like for me, but I'd love to know what the Crataegus garden's been doing.
Good memory, which isn't mine. I mean, I have an apprentice with a great memory. So Jonas is pointing to a problem of using an injector system, which we have been using in my backyard for a few years, and that's a long story why we're doing that. And I would prefer to use cakes on the surface, but I have some trouble using those functionally. But the problem with the injector system is that you can water your whole yard with an even amount of fertilizer, and half the trees get less than they want and half the trees get more than they want. And then you start seeing aesthetic reactions to that. I don't like that. So the problem is that, and then the correction is either to have somebody with a remarkable memory like Andrew or John, who've managed to remember what they did last week and do it differently this week, what they hit with this last week, and to change it up. So you can do that. You can schedule different dilutions. This week we're doing this. This week we're doing that.
Well, how do you do the two trees on the bench that are sitting next to each other with different needs?
I was just going to put that up there.
Okay.
You create a different cluster of trees on different benches. So you separate them according to their fertilizer needs, which, can complicate things because we have different needs in both watering and fertilizing for even the same species of plant, just different individuals. So it can look like the yard that you don't want. So it can look confusing to anybody but the person who's watering and fertilizing. So that maybe not the best solution if we want our yards to look beautiful.
Well, so do you just water the whole garden twice, once with the fertilizer on, once with the fertilizer off? That's the part that's getting to me, is I have a decandled pine next to a non-decandled pine. Exactly. And I have to water my entire garden twice.
Exactly.
Or I hit every other tree with fertilizer, then I turn it off and I hit every other tree. Have you come up with a better solution than that?
No.
Gosh.
I think honestly that slow release fertilizers are the answer to all our bad dreams. And this is where the tradition has the gold, really. These slow release organic cakes that you apply to the surface, and then every time you water, a little bit trickles in and a little bit trickles out. It's hard to over fertilize. It's hard to under fertilize. I was surprised recently. One of my clients did a soil test of one of his trees, and we discovered that the mineral content, it's really important minerals, things like nitrogen and calcium and things that are like macronutrients, were at critically low levels. And we realized that even though he was fertilizing every week, either with fish emulsion or Dynagrow, which are these nice mild organic and inorganic fertilizers, he had almost nothing there. And we saw some weird, the trees, the color wasn't so great. And we weren't getting, the elm would drop its leaves halfway through the year. And it was weird. I couldn't explain what was going on there until we did the soil test. And it's like, oh. So if you can't use cakes, if you have dogs that love them, or I used to have a student who lived on a houseboat, and the seagulls would snatch them. Rats can go after them. Raccoons. They're everybody loves a fertilizer cake. So if you can't use them, maybe the liquid solution is one option. But I'm seriously starting to consider pelletized. Because I have trouble using the cakes as well, but the little pellets like Osmocote or Apex or something like that, and I don't like that solution because it's hard to remove it when you don't want it. They float, they go away, but on the other hand, they give this little amount of fertilizer every time, and then you can program, okay, how much does this particular specimen require? It's just like putting cakes on. You can with the cakes, it's great because you can see it and you can remove it. The problem with the pelletized solution, again, these are chemical, and we're going to get to another problem with those in just a second, or possible problem. But you can't remove them, and they float away, and it's hard to see what you have there. But it has the advantage of the slow release, which I think is a really good thing for bonsai, because we water so much. If you're in a rainy climate, you're also going to flush things out. But at least you can, individual to individual, give at that moment in time, you can give an appropriate amount of fertilizer according to your goals with that tree. And that will retain its effectiveness for some months. And that's a great thing. That's a really, really great thing. So I was going to mention a problem. So, and I don't know if this is a problem. This is one of these rumors that I've heard for 2 decades, about the fact that a chemical fertilizer, I've been using this term interchangeably with inorganic, both of them are incorrect, but anyway, we won't go into that. But using a chemical fertilizer on bonsai will create brittle branches. I have no idea if this is true or not. And I would love somebody to jump up and do some citizen science experiment that will show us whether certain trees actually become more brittle. Because if they do, we might still be able to use chemical fertilizers, maybe during a time of the year like fall, when they're not putting down the kind of tissues that create brittleness. I don't know the answer to that question either. So that, you know, there's a bunch of questions in there that I would really love answered. But some of these are fairly mild. You know, they don't have super high numbers. You can control the amount given your scatter percentage. I think it's a real strong option. I know Peter T uses Osmocote. I know Boone was using, I think, Apex for a while, and you know, trees look greener. But I mean, greenness isn't everything, but it's part of health.
It's a good start.
It's a good start, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty much exactly where you are about the attitudes toward liquid fertilizer. Really, really frustrating to try to get it right. The dry on the surface just solves so many problems.
Yeah. Yes, it does.
Well, thank you. We'll just have to continue inventing that. And we're
I
both
guess so.
all ears. If any of you have some awesome suggestions
Yes.
for us, let us know.
Yes, please.
Well, I want to talk about the book itself a little bit. Tell me about the Bonsai Heresy team, where it could have just been you that was typesetting this and hand printing it all and selling it yourself, but I'm going to guess there was something more to it than that.
Yeah, thankfully, I had enough on my hands writing this thing and triple checking myself. Writing a technical book is a horror, at least it is for me, because I'm not built that way. But we had a great team. I do want to give a shout out to the people who put their hearts into this one. It was definitely a labor of love for me, and it ended up being something that other people got really invested with. And I want to start with Wayne Shea, who runs Stone Lantern, where you can find Bonsai Heresy. This is the only distributor of the book. You can't go on Amazon and find it. But Wayne, we've had an association for quite a while. He carries Post Dated, which is my first book, The Schooling of an Irreverent Bonsai Monk. That was my anecdotal report of the madness of being an apprentice in Japan, published in 2008. And he was selling that. And we really enjoyed working with one another. And I self-published that book. So I would package up a certain number of books and send it to him. And I still do that. And with Heresy, he wanted to be a little more involved. He asked me if we wanted to team up on it. And I said I was really clear that I wanted to retain my rights as a self-publisher, and he offered to cover the cost of printing it. And I had to write him back. I said, "Let me get this straight. I'm a self-publisher, and you're a and you're going to." I'm very proud of our association. I talk with many people in the publishing industry, and I told them this story, and they've never even heard of a story like this. So I really am honored by the trust that Wayne had in me and in the book, and really enjoyed that. Also, just Sergio was incredible to work with. Sergio Kwan, many of you might know him, great bonsai artist. I think he appeared in Bill Vanis's magazine recently. Great bonsai artist. He's an animator. He works for Nickelodeon, and I approached him very early on about this, that I didn't want to use photography. I wanted to use several ironic images, really colorful, like the opposite of wabi sabi. And he loved the idea, you know. It was so, but I had no idea what it was going to look like. I mean, I didn't even know Sergio. Actually, we had never actually met. He was a friend of Andrew's and my past apprentice, and so he hooked us up, and Sergio and I started talking, and it was a really fun association. I still remember the day I got my first color illustration. Up to that point, I couldn't see it, and I remember I took an hour off of work and just took a walk. I was so excited. It's just, I could finally see the book, because it was a risk. I mean, the book uses entirely word images rather than photographic images in order to share ideas and concepts. So it was tricky. So I'm glad Sergio did that. Also, Mary Russell, although technical issue was my copy editor, she was so much more than that. Many of you might know Mary. She lives up in the Twin Cities area. She read some of the early drafts, which were dreadful, and she was so supportive and really helpful in restructuring the book from the horror that it was into something that people might actually want to read. She was great. She also worked on Post-Dated. So several of these, even Jennifer Omner, the book designer, she designed Post-Dated and did the interior design of this one. Laura Nelson was proofreader. She was a great member of the team. Leah Eads, John's wife, actually created a font for the cover and the spine of Bonsai Heresy. I couldn't believe what she did. It was unbelievable. She was amazing. And then 10 content editors who read the early drafts and added so much to this book. That was amazing. And then it was kind of a family affair as well. My mother did the bibliography. She has a background in libraries, and was able to hunt down some rare facts and just did an amazing job with that. And then I took a stab at this as well. I did the index, which was a lot of fun. And if you enjoyed the humor in Bonsai Heresy, read the index. I don't think most of us read indexes, but I tried to continue that through the index. So anyway, it was a super team. I really had a lot of fun, and I was happy with the product we came up with.
It's pretty fantastic, and it's not the kind of thing you expect when you pick up a bonsai book off the shelf. There are just a lot of touches that you would just not expect, and probably the biggest one of those is the fact that it is illustrated rather than adorned with photographs. And so say more about the decision to eschew photos for the word images or colorful illustrations you ended up using.
Okay, so the word images, it was a bit of a, I was playing. I mean, writing for me for a while now has been sort of like deep play, so like what we do when we're not working. We have a hobby that we that we go as deep or as interested in as we might be in our careers, but it's something completely different, a way to get away from it. Even though I was writing about bonsai, I wanted to do it in a way that was that I hoped would be a sneakier way to get to the heart of the matter. And I felt that with images, we're going to retain the same triggers that we tend to have with all the other great bonsai books that we have out there, that, especially inspiration and things like that. There's wonderful photographic inspiration books. Our world is replete with them, and they're great. Instagram is, Facebook, we have so much of that. And yet my sense was that our bonsai really weren't improving, even though we had, great examples, which we didn't have when I first started bonsai. And yet when I first started bonsai, we had all these problems that we set and we passed around, and so we shared them to the point that we got so familiar with them that I felt like I didn't need images to describe these things. These are things that so many people who read this book are going to recognize. And so although it was a challenge to not use photographs, that was the intention, was to use it. The imagery that was going to be there was going to be as ironic as the text, or as ironic as the chapter titles, which are in quotation marks, which I mean the opposite of what this myth is. And so Sergio got that immediately. He's a humorist. He's such a funny visual artist that he took the only thing, he came up with all of these crazy visual ideas and they would make me laugh out loud. But the only input I had was on the cover. That was my idea, the match, but everything else was his. And only thing we agreed on was which chapter to illustrate. And then he went off, and I didn't hear from him for a month or something. And then he would come back with some of these illustrations, and they were hilarious. But they were ironic. And that was my point. So his, he would take the chapter title, and then he would fit into it what I actually believe is going on, which is the opposite of the chapter title. So the illustrations are ironic. So anyway, it was a risk. The whole thing was a risk. I had no idea if it would work. But that's a part of deep play that I really enjoy about writing. Writing is, it has been so much fun for me. I didn't really start writing until I started keeping a journal in Japan when I was an apprentice, and I've written on and off since then. And then my blog, the weekly writing that I do for the blog, has transformed it, I think, a little bit. I don't have your background, unfortunately, so I had to kind of teach myself the hard way. But I really enjoy writing really early in the morning. I usually get up before it's light, and I write for 1 or 2 hours. I feel that we're more innocent then, we're not polluted by the day. And I discovered much later that many professional writers write in the mornings. And maybe that's why, but anyway, that's why that feels good to me, to write in the mornings.
I'm really glad that you did it the way you did, because it, like you say, not only gets to focus on the more intellectual concepts and tries to fight the bad words with good words, but it also gave us the gift of having the fun images of the book. It just makes it a fun physical object to work with. And what I find is there are little tiny, you actually have to look at the images closely, and that there's funny little jokes embedded in a lot of the images that you just don't catch at first glance. Like there might be a pot decorated with a bikini, for instance.
Yeah. So Sergio sent me a one-line email for that one. He says, "Michael, can I put a bikini on a bonsai pot?" And I immediately laughed. I mean, that was my initial reaction. I was like, and then I started getting worried. I wrote him back. I was like, "Yeah, I think this is hilarious, but I don't know. I don't think." And then he wrote me back and said, "Michael, we're not, writing a book for kids." And and then I said, "Yeah, you're right. Okay, just go with it." So anyway, it's kind of embedded in there. It's a little hard to see, but search for that one. That's really good.
Yeah.
But there's another. I mean, the images were fun to share and to see people's reactions. I remember when I sent you the cover image, and I did it. I learned something. I didn't do this again, but I sent it by email, and so you got this big attachment that blew up, and unfortunately it didn't show the whole thing. So for those of you who know the cover of Bonsai Heresy, there's this match, and there's the head of the match, and then there's this huge flame coming off it. It's very incinerary, and you saw the top of that, and not that it was a match, but you saw this little head. It looked like somebody's head was bursting aflame, and you were horrified. And, and I was just like, okay, now I'm going to send a little text image which will show the whole thing to others to get their response. But I do want to thank you, Jonas, for being such a big part of this. This was it was so much fun, actually, to hunt down some of these things. Some of the bigger ones were the ones around black pine decandling. The full story behind that, which I didn't know, and you helped me greatly with that. Also, the azalea chapter, there were a lot of details. There were some people that you knew that knew a lot more than I did that were about azaleas that played into that chapter. And then the one on fertilizer, that was fascinating to talk with you about, and your understanding and knowledge of some of the things that were going on in Japan as well. You played a huge role in this book. And if you are a Jonas fan, there's a number of really great quotes in Bonsai Heresy from Jonas. So a lot of people were involved with it. Joe Harris, too, who lives here in Portland, was a real major part of the content team.
Oh, just fantastic contributions you provided.
That is,
Well, actually, on that exact topic, I was curious, were there some discoveries during your research for the book that made you want to dig a lot deeper, maybe beyond what you could fit in the book?
Oh, wow. Some of the things were coming up as the book was going into publication that I realized was actually going to be a revision, because, like I started with the dentist story, that 50% of what I share with you is going to be incorrect, but I have no idea what 50% it is. There's some things in here that I'm sure we're going to have better ideas of in 10, 15 years. So I'll probably do a revision at some point. There were some chapters that I pulled that probably won't ever be in Bonsai Heresy. I took them out because I realized that they weren't based on tradition or science, and that they were more opinion. And I have another book I'm working on, which is a collection of essays, and it is definitely opinion. And that book is, the working title is Yanking on Needles, and that is a few years out. But I don't have Yeah, nothing. Forget it. Yeah, John's gonna have to cut that one out too. A lot of cutting for John this morning. Oh no. Anyway, okay, start again, or maybe wrap up. We're pretty.
Oh, that one's fine. I was just going to ask, were there any questions you had when working on the book that you just couldn't find answers to?
Oh, wow. Let me think.
Where you thought, here's a good myth. Oh, wait, I can't find anything that.
Well, yeah, in the growth enhancers, yeah, there were. I looked at several of the products that were offered, some really famous ones. Super Thrive is one. The other is HB 101. There's a few backyard things, and one really small study with Super Thrive, and absolutely nothing with HB 101 in terms of science done on these. How effective are these? That kind of a study. And I just had to leave those as question mark. I mean, I had no idea. The truth is, as Linda Chalker Scott mentioned, this horticulturalist that I interviewed for this, she said, almost all of these growth enhancers that are sold for huge bucks for the amount that you get, they all have nutrients in them, so
Yes.
They probably all do something. But the real question is it worth it? I mean, here you have, Super Thrive is a great example. It might be the easiest one to, point to for that one example, because you get like 4 ounces of it for $12. And, a quarter of a drop had better do an awful lot for that kind of money. And yet you can buy, even a non-brand, fertilizer that might well do your trade just as well. So at the end of her discussion, she pretty much said, just keep simple and let nature do its work. You probably don't need most of these. Having said that, there's some very interesting ones. I mean, I think silicon was a very interesting investigation. There is some research behind that, and that was interesting. Seaweed has some interesting results. I'm very curious with the hormones that are found in them. I think there's cytokinin found in them. I remember Peter Warren saying something that he had seen more budding on white pine, having used seaweed. I believe it was seaweed. Anyway, there's some things that there's just some trails that I didn't go down, that I don't really have any answers for, and for some there probably, or maybe is some research out there that I just didn't find.
You first told me about the book, I think it was 12 years ago. So I knew that this one was percolating through your mind for a very, very long time. And so I imagine the continued process of following some of these threads will be at least another 12 years.
Yeah, probably. At a certain point, you kind of have to kick the kid out of the house. So, I had to let it go and then do something else. But yeah, there continues to be percolation. And I would actually, if anybody has threads to offer, research or something else, or a disagreement with a chapter or something, please send me an email. There will be a revision someday, and hopefully better, more accurate information. And I will try to include some of that in the next one.
I love it. So tell me, why is writing a book hard?
Oh, wow. Having written one, I think you agree that it is.
Yes.
But why it is, I'm going to ask you that question tomorrow morning when we interview you. But for me, it's work. I have a lot of fun with it, but writing a book, the darn thing's going to be published, and that's a scary idea. People are going to actually read what you think, and they carry big clubs. I mean, you don't want to get something wrong. So there's, especially with a technical book like this, it's really challenging. If you're just writing a story, it's a smaller club. It's like, okay, that's his story. He's a crazy person. But if you're trying to write something that you think applies to a field and is applicable to what many people do, I found that really hard to do. Even get to the point to think, I should be doing something like that. So that that was a bit of a challenge. Yeah. And then just the production of the book, and you had a very different experience. I want to ask you about this one later, but you worked with a publisher, and I'm very curious about what input you had there. So anyway, we'll cover that later.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. This was an absolutely fascinating chat, and I learned a whole lot from it.
It was great fun. Thank you. Thank you.
And again, as Michael mentioned, the book Bonsai Heresy is available from Stone Lantern. Very easy to find. And the book is packed with, oh gosh, what are we up to? 343 pages, 345 pages, one photograph of most of the author's face, at least one reference in the index to the Starship Enterprise, plenty of images from Sergio, and some bonsai information in between all that.
Great.
Does that sound about right?
I love it. I love it. I should have had that on the back cover. That's perfect. Oh man, that was so much fun. Thank you. Great.
Well,
great,
you
great
made
questions.
it so easy because you wrote a book that's really fun and easy to talk about. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you for Michael, and we'll talk to you all again soon.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
The music on today's podcast was brought to you by the fine folks at Blue Dot Sessions. Check them out at www.sessions.blue. Also, the advertisements are fake.
Sorry, I'm crunching. This is an apple. Very good apple.
Well, I'll let you crunch a little bit before I start up again.
Yeah.